it sounds like this is almost the development of a criteria for material selection. So this is something we can teach to design students, in the sense that, yeah, okay, so you're doing a new project, you're thinking about your materials. This is the rubric by which you should measure the suitability of this material for now and for the future.
I think part of what I was trying to like sort of flesh out through this project is this question of criteria, is this question of language. What kind of vocabulary do we need to talk? Plastic is easier to talk about because it's basically all made from petroleum, a little bit from natural gas, increasingly stuff from coal. But when you talk about something like cement, it's not made of a fossil fuel, but it's made of fossilized carbon. And so there's a vocabulary piece, like I've been using the phrase fossil carbon, which isn't common vernacular, so it often causes people to trip. Even a concept like carbon negative is like, people are like, wait, is that the good way or the bad way? We definitely need new tools and language tools for talking about this, and I think for the next generation it will be important. On a challenge like climate change, the barriers are not actually technological barriers at this point. It's about a lack of vision and clarity of purpose, that we can do it and it's there to take. And so there's actually a sort of a hopeful way of holding on to climate change that comes through thinking about it in terms of materials that sort of felt worth sharing and pushing and continuing to experiment with.
Do you see your interest in algae as kind of connected with these kinds of plant and fungal materials, or is this a kind of different framing for you?
I sort of fell into that backwards from focusing on climate change and sunlight. Part of why I focus on algae and why I focus on marine macroalgae is because we currently live in a system where more than 60% of our textiles, for example, are made of petrochemicals. And if we want to decarbonize that, we have to figure out a way to make useful materials that can fit some of those needs that are not based on ancient sunlight, petrochemical, ancient fossilized carbon, that are made of contemporary stored sunlight energy in the form of carbon. And to do that without merely making a swap becomes really important, because otherwise we end up in a food versus fuel debate that we were back in sort of the mid-aughts, where if you're merely taking corn that used to be produced for human consumption and now you're making plastic out of it, you're not actually making more use of the sunlight we already have. And if we want to disentangle ourselves from fossil fuels, we have to very practically be thinking about how to do more with the solar flux we already have. Because before the Industrial Revolution, before we were using these ancient hydrocarbons, we didn't have 7.7 billion people. And so to build a new system that's not dependent on hydrocarbons, we need to figure out how to do more with the sunlight we have. And there's enough sunlight. That's part of what's like hopeful about this. In 90 minutes, we're hit by as much solar energy as we use in fuel in a year. But we need to be using it very carefully and deliberately if we want to decarbonize, if we want to change the impact of our, say, material ecosystem on climate change.
What you're saying is there's also a tension or a delicate balance we need to keep between food resources and resources for building and design.
Yeah. That's where I think always a tension of trying to make something that is new, that is trying to intervene in the status quo, is that there's so much pressure to, for instance, just with the plastic, like to make it as durable and machinable and industrial as this status quo material so that it can be drop-in. But that durability is part of the problem of the materials we're trying to replace. So how do you avoid this sort of suction of the systems that surround the status quo materials when in fact we need to be redesigning all of these systems? It seems unthinkable to imagine living life without fossil fuels and fossil fuel-based materials, but we've only been doing it for 150 years. Like, we can figure something else out.